Hello, this is Linda Douglas. I'm the Trauma-Informed Services Specialist for the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. If you haven't met me yet, I hope to meet you soon. And this is the Trauma, Mental Health, and Substance Abuse course that I often go to programs and do for volunteer training. If you're taking this course today, it's because you haven't been able to take part in that regular volunteer training. And I want to give you pretty much the same information that's given out at those trainings. So today we're talking about trauma, mental health, and substance abuse. And we haven't always talked about trauma. You know, we used to talk about trauma as being something that happened to people when they went to war. That was the wartime trauma. Men would come back from war, the Civil War, the World Wars, and people would say, well, they weren't quite the same, or they had shell shock. But it was during the Vietnam War that they first really became aware of post-traumatic stress disorder. They started to work with the vets in the hospitals, and were trying to figure out what was actually happening to them. And what we know is that they were in the hospitals. They were having what were being diagnosed at the time as delusional disorders, and were being medicated as if they were delusional. But what we do know is that someone sat down, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk actually says he was there, and realized that what was happening is that the veterans were actually having flashbacks of their experiences in Vietnam. And so they realized that they couldn't medicate these soldiers with the same medication that they did for delusional disorders, that they had to do it with different types of medication. So what we know is that then in the late 1900s, there were some medical advances that created functional magnetic resonance imaging, that we were able to start seeing what actually happens in the brain at times of high stress. And they were able to map what actually happens and which areas of the brain are most affected. So this became very, very important in the study of neurobiology. And then in the early 1990s, Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, was published, and I highly recommend that you find a copy of this. Most libraries have it, but you can easily get it on A-Libris or some other used book website. It's actually a very good book in regards to how to work with people who have experienced interpersonal violence. So, and then there's the 1995 Adverse Childhood Experiences study that I'll go into a little bit more in a moment. So first we want to think about what trauma is. And trauma, according to SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health and Services Administration, are those events and circumstances that may have an actual or extreme threat of psychological or physical harm. It's where a person feels like their life is going to change in a great way, in a negative way, that there's life-threatening. For a child, it's that neglect that is going to affect their healthy development, but it can also be natural disasters and violence and a number of things that we'll actually be talking about in a couple of minutes with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. But what also affects whether or not it's a trauma for a person is how the person experiences those events. And that, for some people, an event may be traumatic, but for other people, the same event may not be so. And it has to do a lot with the person's temperament, the amount of trauma that they've been through before, the amount of resiliency, a number of things that we're going to be talking about through the rest of this webcast. And then those adverse effects could occur immediately, or they just may have a delayed onset. For some people, they don't really realize the impact that the event is going to have on them until much later. So we know that gender-based violence increases the risk of developing mental health and substance abuse conditions, and we've learned that women are twice as likely as men to develop PTSD after trauma exposure and to experience depression. There are higher rates of PTSD among sexual assault victims than there are amongst war veterans. And we also now know that adverse childhood experiences increase the risk for mental health, and substance abuse problems as an adult. So now I want to talk about the adverse childhood experiences study. I talk about this a lot. It's a very important study. It started out in San Diego, California by Dr. Vincent Felitti. He was running a weight loss program in San Diego at the Kaiser Permanente program. And he had a number of people that were coming in. The group was primarily, well, there was about 17,000 people that went through this. They were primarily white, middle class to lower upper class people who could afford health insurance. So these were not people who were living in poverty. They were, again, not the most racially diverse group, but as Dr. Felitti likes to say, this was a group of people that we did not think that bad things were going to happen to them. So that set up this study, and here's what happened. So this is Patty. Patty is someone that Dr. Felitti was working with in the program. She came into the weight loss program in the 1980s, and as you can see, she started out here weighing 408 pounds. And after 51 weeks, she was down to 132 pounds. Dr. Felitti said the program was one where they gave people, put the people on a liquid diet, did behavior modification, some counseling, supplements to make sure they didn't starve to death, and just basically did this weight loss program with them for a year. But I want you to look at Patty here on the left side of your screen and think about what people might say about Patty. What people who, people like internet trolls, people who just don't have an understanding of the things that could cause a person to gain weight. Things like, well, she just doesn't know how to take care of herself. She's lazy. She, doesn't eat the right kinds of food. She just doesn't care about herself. She's a drain on society. Why should we have to, our taxes go to pay for whatever? That's what people might say to her. She's the type of person people would be looking very closely at her grocery cart when she's in the grocery store. So here's what happened. Patty was doing really well. She started out up here at the 408 pounds, and over the next 60 weeks, she steadily lost weight until she got down to the 132. But then you can see here that all of a sudden, Patty's weight just jumped up, and once it reached 200 pounds, then it just continued to go right back up again. And Dr. Felitti was talking to her, right around this period here at about 65 weeks, and trying to find out why her weight went back up all of a sudden. So let's go back here. So we have Patty. She's in her nice nurse's uniform, and after a while, Patty admitted to Dr. Felitti that she had been at work, and that her boss, who was an older gentleman, had come up to her and started making sexually explicit comments to her about the things that he would like to do to her now that she had lost the weight. And Patty reported to Dr. Felitti that she decided, well, she went home that night. I don't know if it was so much a decision on her part, but she went home and she started to binge eat, and she couldn't stop. And that's where this weight gain started to come in. So Dr. Felitti was like, that's, a pretty intense reaction to this event. Is there something else this could be related to? And Patty eventually admitted that she had been sexually assaulted by her grandfather when she was a child over a number of years. So now we see that this precipitating factor was actually a reminder of the sexual assault that she had experienced as a child. So what Dr. Felitti did is he started talking to other people who were engaging in unhealthy behaviors after their weight loss. And he discovered that there were common experiences amongst this group. And they include these things up in the box here: the experiencing physical, sexual, or psychological abuse, witnessing violence towards mother, having household members with substance abuse, suicide attempts or incarcerations, having a family member with mental illness. There were 10 adverse childhood experiences, all total, for this particular group. It's important to know that this study is being replicated now with other groups, urban populations, immigrants and refugees, because we know that there are more adverse experiences that happen to a child depending on where they live and which race they belong to, and there may be intergenerational trauma. But it's just important that for this particular group of people in San Diego, California, these 10 things were the most common things for that particular group. And in that group, 50% of the people reported at least one, and 25% reported 2 or more, with women 3.5 times as likely to have 5 or more ACEs. Now, I've worked in substance abuse treatment programs in the past, and I know when I was working with women that there were often women that I worked with that had 8, 9, or 10 of these adverse childhood experiences. So, and we also know that the greater number of these experiences leads to poor health problems. You know, having 50 or more sexual partners, the obesity and the physical inactivity, the alcoholism, drug abuse, and smoking may be a part of this. And then there's depression, psychiatric hospitalization, suicide attempts, and hallucinations. Any of those ACEs will increase a person's suicide risk by 2 to 5 times. So what we know now is that adverse childhood experiences are very common but largely unrecognized, and they're strong predictors of later social problems and impact well-being, health risk, disease, medical costs, and can even be deadly. The ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, are the basis for much of adult medicine and of many major public and health social problems. So they're interrelated, they're not solitary. If one is occurring, more than likely there are more that are connected to that. So the Center for Disease Control got involved in this and has determined that this combination makes adverse childhood experiences the leading determinant of the health, social, and economic well-being of our nation. So here you can see this is a person's ACE score, and this is the risk of them becoming an alcoholic. So as you can see, as it goes up, the risk becomes greater. The reason this doesn't go any higher is because once you reach 4, when you get to 5 or 6 as your ACE score, it goes up even exponentially. It's just the difference between 4 and 5 is great. Same here for injection drug use. You can see how the risk of injection drug use goes up as more ACE scores are added on. So again, adverse childhood experiences are the most basic and long-lasting cause of health risk behavior, mental illness, social malfunction, disease, disability, death, and healthcare costs. And then they underlie these national problems. You can see a number of the things that we see on a daily basis: reproductive health, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, sexual behavior, mental health, the risk of re-victimization. These adverse childhood experiences increase a person's vulnerability. You know, I had someone say to me once that they were working with a woman who just continued to choose men who abuse her. Well, I put it to you like this, is that when we are born, we're like a hard-boiled egg with a shell on it. And the first thing that happens to us is if you take that egg and tap it against the table, and that egg starts to crack. And that's that first adverse childhood experience. And then as more things happen, that egg becomes more and has more and more cracks in it until eventually some of that shell starts to peel away. And the more adverse childhood experiences you have and the more shell that you lose, as you grow older, you lose that shell. You lose the idea that you ever had a shell. You don't think you deserve to have that shell. And if you think of that shell as boundary, some people don't realize that they are even allowed to have boundaries. And so perpetrators are looking for vulnerable victims. Victims are not looking for perpetrators as much as perpetrators are looking for those vulnerable victims. So now we know that what are conventionally viewed as public health problems are often personal solutions to long-concealed adverse childhood experiences. For Patty, the weight was not the problem. The food, the overeating was not the problem. The problem was that she had been sexually assaulted as a child and she was trying to feel differently. I once worked with a young man who said, "I'm not addicted to heroin, I'm addicted to not feeling my feelings." So as you can see here, another graphic is that the adverse childhood experiences over here, the more types of adverse childhood experiences, the greater the neurobiological impacts and health risks, and then the more serious lifelong consequences to health and well-being. We spend a lot of money as a society over here on the right hand of the screen, and not enough time and money here trying to mitigate and help children who have experienced adverse childhood experiences. What the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study has done is it has explained to us how people are falling into the river. If you think of the story about going down to the river and there's people who are struggling and in the water, and the community comes down and tries to pull them out. It just keeps pulling more and more people out, and there's more people coming down the river. What we eventually have to do is to go up the river and find out why people are falling in the first place. And this is what the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study has done, is explain to us why people are falling in the river. So the survivors that we work with are experiencing multiple types of trauma. We've talked about the childhood victimization, which increases their risk for abuse as an adult. Some of the coping strategies that they have learned as children and as young adults may increase their risk for being harmed. I often put it like this, is that if you've grown up in an environment where you're surrounded by sharks, you're going to develop strategies and skills around living with sharks. And those strategies and skills may not necessarily translate real well into society as a whole. They may include things like manipulating those sharks, or lying to those sharks, or yelling a lot to make sure those sharks hear you. So these are the types of things that could maybe increase the risk for being harmed even more. People may have not learned that they had a right to protect themselves from harm. That's where they've lost that shell. And our survivors also experience social, political, cultural, historical, and immigration-related trauma. So they come to us with all of this stuff that's happened to them and to the society that they lived in, and things that happened to the generations before them. Because one of the things that we're learning more and more about is that the impact on our grandparents and our great-grandparents and our parents can affect the DNA of future generations and impact how folks respond to the adversities in their life. It can actually change a person's DNA and cause them to have health impact on their health due to the trauma that happened in other generations. The good news is that the good things, the resiliency factors, those things that help make a generation healthier, can also impact future generations also. So it's not all bad news. So protective factors and resilience can definitely mitigate the impact of trauma on the current and future generations. So just some things in regards to resiliency. Attachment is so important. It's the most important thing that it can help a person. If a child grows up in an environment where there is someone who is with them, who cares about them, who wants to protect them, who sees them as having some worth. This can be a parent, It can be a grandparent, a neighbor, a teacher, a school counselor, someone who's there for them. And by having this relationship, it helps this person be able to develop some self-regulation skills. Those are the skills that help them calm themselves in times of distress. Being able to develop some coping skills, some productive ways of being in society and getting needs met. And so that helps the person then feel competent in their life, and that's how they build the resiliency. So for teens, this is a slide from the Adolescent Health Working Group. The examples are that for attachment, youth are provided with receptive, attuned caregiving from adults. And so then they develop empathy, impulse control, healthy boundaries, and conflict management skills. And then those teens can be insightful, prioritize tasks, make good judgments, and just go on to be able to live strong, effective lives. So that attachment that we have in childhood makes, can be expanded beyond the primary caregiver. And early trauma makes forming adult relationships difficult. So you can see that if there was strong attachment as a child, that's going to help our ability to be able to trust and seek out safe supports as adults. But if it's not, and we have trouble forming those adult relationships, then we're going to have difficulty trusting and seeking out support. And they're not going to trust social support. So they may even look at advocates as being, they'll be suspicious of advocates, and they won't know how to relate and be fearful of possibly being rejected or not getting their needs met. And so at times, the people that we work with, it can not be an easy thing. And so one of the things that's very important, and this is one of the 3 things that I really want to get across to you, is that don't take anything personally, because it's usually when they have trouble working with us, it has to do with their trauma. And if they're angry at us, or if they're not showing up for appointments, or they just seem resistant to our help, it's because they're really having a hard time engaging, because they don't know what it means to be able to have a healthy relationship. And they're scared of opening themselves up to future hurt and not getting their needs met. So that's one of the 3 things, is don't take anything personally. The first thing, actually, I forgot to tell you, is that one of the things that we say about trauma is that when we're working with somebody, we understand that it's not that there's something wrong with the person, that something happened to the person. So you can be working with somebody and you can start looking at them and saying, oh, I wonder what's wrong with her. I invite you just to take a step back when you hear yourself saying that and think about, I wonder what happened in her life to create the way that she's acting, the way that she's behaving in the world, and how can I support her in seeing things differently? How can I help her feel safe? So again, so far 2 things. The first one is it's not what's wrong with the person, it's about what happened to them. And the second thing is don't take anything personally. So let's talk about the brain a little bit and what actually happens in the brain. So here's another example of being able to understand where people are coming from. This is the Jenga tower. So somebody who could come in to see you could have had 2 people could come in and they've had pretty much the same experience. But because of past experience, resiliency factors, the attachment, whether or not they've had a number of things happen to them, one person, their Jenga tower could actually be fairly solid, and this event is not going to have as much of an impact as it will on the other person who's had so many things happen to them that they're getting ready to fall over. So you may not always know what has happened to a person in the past, but just know that all of those things that they bring in with them, besides just the sexual assault or the domestic violence or whatever they're coming in for, there are many, many other things that are impacting how they relate to you and how they seek services. So here's a model of the brain. If you could If I was in the room with you, I would show you my fist. And so I just invite you to take your hand and put it into a fist with your thumb inside your fingers. And that will sort of look, this would be your arm. And this area here is where your thumb is. And this is the amygdala and hippocampal region. And think of this as being the emotional center of the brain. And this area here, where your fingers are, this is the prefrontal cortex. So one thing we know about the brain is that it develops from the bottom up and the inside out, and each part develops based on the experiences that have preceded that development. So the prefrontal cortex, this piece up here, the piece where your fingers are, that doesn't finish developing until we're in our late 20s. But it's there in earlier ages, but it's just not, people aren't as able to think through consequences, be able to plan for the future, those types of things, that this is what this part of the brain is in charge of. So I often laugh and tell people, so if you have a teenager who is doing a lot of things without necessarily thinking the consequences through, and you look at them and say, why did you do that? When they say, I don't know, it really is true. They don't know because they didn't have this part of the brain to be able to think that through. So this is the alarm center of the brain. I think of the thalamus as being the dispatcher. This is the amygdala, which is in charge of our fight, flight, or freeze response. The hippocampal area, which helps us store memories of the event. And again, this is the thinking part of the brain. So here's what happens. You have something happen here, the trigger. I like to call that the activation, and it goes to the thalamus. And so imagine you're driving down a road, and you come around a corner, and there's a moose in the middle of the road. What would be the first thing that you would do? Well, I hope you say that you would slam on the brake, because that's what your body's going to do. It's because your thalamus is going to quickly send the message over to the amygdala and say, you need to act now. If you thought about that moose before you stepped on the brake, that means it would go up here before it goes here, you would more than likely hit the moose because it's going to slow down your reaction time. So this system's been set up to help us survive. And so it helps us in times of great stress, to have that fight, flight, or freeze response. Oops. Okay. So the problem is that we have, if you think about, again, that fist that you have, what's happened is that when the amygdala goes, it's like your thumb comes out from the center and your hand opens up. And so now the it's like an explosion. I think of it as a rocket, where the booster rocket separates from the main capsule. And the booster rocket is the part that's in control now. And the computer system is in the main capsule. It makes sense to me, so I hope it makes sense to you. And the prefrontal cortex may not be able to come back online until the person is safe and stable. And for some people, that may take a while. So we could be working with folks who are completely coming from that emotional center of their brain and are having trouble thinking clearly because their prefrontal cortex is offline, because they're constantly in danger. It's as if the body says, this person's in danger all the time. I have to make sure that my alarm system is working at all times. So there's a number of chemicals and hormones that are released during stress. And these can impact what a victim looks like, how a victim responds. And so we try to teach police officers and other people to understand that all victims are going to react differently, that there is no one way that a victim is going to act. So you could walk into a hospital room or an emergency room or, where you're going to meet somebody, and you're not necessarily going to be able to tell who is the victim. The adrenaline that gets expressed during this could cause somebody to actually have a lot of energy. So the adrenaline and the cortisol together you could have a person who's pacing, who's talking really fast, who seems just overly excited, who is having trouble concentrating. But you could have somebody who also has a number of opiates, natural opiates that get released in the body. And that's to compensate for any physical and emotional pain that occurs during the event. If you think of any time that you have injured yourself and you actually felt more pain 2 days later, say a sports injury or from a car accident, that's because at the time of the injury, the opiates were released in your body, and after a couple of days, those wear off. And then oxytocin is also released, and that, if a lot of that is released, you could have somebody who actually giggles or laughs while they're telling you the story because it's trying to manage the positive feelings. And the reason that that is released in the system is that also helps with pain. And so the mixture of these is different in every single person, and it's going to create a different reaction in each person who's undergone a traumatic event. So another thing that's very important to remember is that memories are stored in the brain based on their senses, whether it's the color, the shape, the sounds, the textures, the odors, all of these things, the taste, all of these things get scattered throughout the brain. And if there's been more than one event, they're going to get scattered and mixed up with each other, like these puzzle pieces that you see on the screen. So all of those pieces are from different, some of those pieces are from one event, other pieces are from another event, and they've all gotten in there and they're mixed up. And so a police officer comes along or someone else and says, you need to tell me what happened, and you need to start at the beginning and not leave anything out. Well, that would be like asking you to reach into this bucket of puzzle pieces and only pick out the pieces for the puzzle that shows a picture of Mount Washington, and being told that you can't pick out any other pieces and that you have to pick out the pieces in the order from the upper left-hand corner of the picture to the lower right-hand corner, and that if you leave anything out, you must be making it up, or if you remember things later, you must be making things up. So this can be very stressful for a person. So what we do is we train police officers and advocates on trauma-informed interviewing. And that's just really basic, helping the person feel comfortable, recognizing that they may need to have a couple of sleep cycles in order to feel safe and stable, making sure the perpetrator is not anywhere nearby, reassuring them that if they forget anything and remember it later, that they can call and give those details. And you ask somebody, go ahead and just tell me what you remember. Start earlier in the day. Tell me how your day started, and let them follow the pieces and put together the pieces as they pull them out. Dr. Rebecca Campbell, who, as you can see, I took a couple of slides from her with her permission, she tells a story of being called to a police station where they were interviewing a sexual assault victim. And they were saying that they were having trouble interviewing this young lady because all she could focus on was her shoes. And so Dr. Campbell sat down with the young woman and built some rapport with her and then said, tell me what happened that day. Why don't you just start out with what you did that morning? And so the young lady says, oh, it was great. My friends and I had gone to the mall and we went to the shoe store and I bought this really great pair of shoes. And of course the police officers are rolling their eyes because here she is going with the shoes again. And but Dr. Campbell just lets her go on, and she says, then I had this really great outfit and I knew we were going out, so I was looking forward to going out. So that night we're getting ready and I'm looking really good and I've got these really great shoes on. And then we go to the club and I'm dancing and I remember my feet hurt and I wanted to take off my shoes so bad, but I knew they looked so good so I didn't want to take them off. And then we were leaving the club and we were walking and I was thinking, oh, I'm going to be home pretty soon and I can go ahead and take off my shoes. And that's when he grabbed me. and pulled me into the alley, and then she was able to relate what had happened to her. And the police were then able to go back and find that alley, find the drag marks, find her shoes, be able to get the evidence that they needed. But what they needed to do at the beginning was just basically literally follow her shoes, follow her story of the shoes, because that's all she could concentrate on that moment. But those were the details that took her to the story that she needed to be able to tell. So when someone has experienced a lot of trauma, it's going to impact their worldview. They're going to feel that the world is an unsafe place to live in, and that other people are unsafe and can't be trusted. And so again, that's for you to remember that it's not that something's wrong with them, that something happened to them, and not to take it personally when they can't trust you, because they can only base their experience on their past experience. They don't even trust their own thoughts and feelings, because there are times when they thought they were safe and suddenly they had body responses, because the memories of trauma lives in the cells of our bodies. So they could have been activated or triggered by sounds or smells, and suddenly they had trouble breathing, or their heart started racing, and they had no idea as to why that was happening. And so they don't even trust their own body anymore. And it could have been anything. It could have been that sight or sound, but it could have been the time of day, or it could have been a time of year where it's an anniversary of something that happened to them. So because of all of these things that have happened in the past, they're going to believe that these things are going to continue to happen in the future, and they're going to have a hard time believing that anything's going to get any better. In fact, they may even have a sense of a foreshortened future, which basically means they don't feel like they're going to live very long. They just don't see much of the future ahead of them. Because of the things that they've been told by perpetrators, or their inability to be able to get back on their feet, or getting the help that they need, they believe that they're not worthy of anything better in their lives. They believe that the things that are happened to them are because of things that they've done. And so they take a lot of this on themselves, instead of understanding that these things happen to them. And they might possibly be walking around with some suicidal ideation. I firmly believe that trauma survivors do carry suicide ideation with them a lot. It doesn't mean that they're going to do it, but they will talk about it. And it's partly about, I just want to be able to have some control over my life, and I want to have control over when this is going to end, because I don't know how much more I'm going to be able to take. So just a reminder that triggers or activations are those things that people see, feel, or hear that remind them of the past trauma. And it often activates the alarm system as if something is happening all over again, and they're going to respond as if there's current danger. And they may do that when they're with you. So being trauma-informed is being able to reduce the number of triggers that may occur for them. So if you're talking to someone, let them know what strange sounds they might hear. Give them an idea. Let them choose where they want to sit. Let them be able to see the door if they need to. Just to understand everything in the environment that around you that could possibly cause a trigger. Even just with the location of the bathroom, or if somebody's going to break in on your meeting with them. Just being able to do everything you can. That's what being trauma is responsive is that understanding that people have these traumas. We don't necessarily know what they all are, but what can we do with ourselves and the environment in order to reduce the chance of them being triggered or being activated, and so that they feel safe with you and in the environment that they're in. So some of the things that could be triggers are if they're reminded of the past events. So they're talking to you, they're going to be reminded. If they feel like they don't have any power or control in their current situation. They may have conflicts in their relationships. Anything that makes them feel vulnerable is going to be a trigger. So separation or loss, changes in their routine and schedule. Trauma survivors like to know what's going to happen next. It's how they take care of themselves. They don't like surprises. They don't like feeling vulnerable or rejected because then they don't feel safe with the person who they feel is rejecting them. And loneliness is who's going to be with me, how am I going to be taken care of. And just being in situations where there's a sensory overload, where they're having to keep track of too many things at one time, so that they don't know how they're going to keep themselves safe because of everything that's happening to them. So I just want to remind you, because of having grown up with sharks, that people are terrified and they're going to try and manipulate. And when we talk to them about substance abuse, which I'll be doing in a minute, they're going to be afraid to talk about it because they can't live without their substance. And so they may lie to you about using substances because they're afraid they're going to be forced to give up their substance. And right now, the coping skills that they have are the best that they can do until they learn other ways to cope. And so drinking or using drugs is the best they can do until they learn where to get some help. And so hopefully you can talk to your direct service coordinator or other staff about the things that your program does to help people get help with substance use. So just a reminder on the trauma framework, it just normalizes the human responses to trauma. It's recognizing that trauma is not the exception, that we look at things not as symptoms but as adaptations. So we don't diagnose people. We don't say, well, this person has borderline personality disorder, or this person is suffering from this, major depressive disorder. We want to understand that some of those symptoms that we're seeing are actually survival strategies, that these are coping mechanisms, and that they are overwhelmed. And it takes us to that point where, remember, we're thinking about not what's wrong with you, but understanding what happened to you. And when we can tell people that, it is such a relief for them to hear that, wait, you mean there's nothing wrong with me? It's all because of what happened to me. Sometimes when people do the adverse childhood experiences checklist and are able to see what their ACE score is, they suddenly sit back and they go, wow, that explains a lot. And they actually feel better because now they have an explanation for how they're feeling, because so many times it's like, I don't know why I feel this way. But once they understand that it's what happened to them, then they can move on and start finding ways in order to be able to adapt in a more productive manner. So we want to talk about substance abuse and mental health conditions. So there are higher rates of substance abuse and mental health conditions amongst women who've been victimized, and high rates of victimization among women in mental health and substance abuse treatment. So those substance abuse and mental health conditions increases a person's chance of being victimized. Self-medication, the use of drugs and alcohol, remember we talked about with the adverse childhood experiences study, is common and may be focused on a specific symptom. But we also want to remember that many victims are coerced into using or dealing drugs, or prevented from getting treatment, or from stopping using by their perpetrator. The use of drugs and alcohol and mental health conditions increases the risk for them being coerced by an abusive partner. So batterers use mental health and substance abuse issues to control their partners. And they do this in a number of ways. They can control their meds, they may coerce an overdose, or they're going to control the treatment. Because if as the batterer is thinking, if I can control the treatment, then I can control my victim. They'll control the supply, they'll coerce the victim into using, and they'll coerce the illegal activities. So often it could be even as simple as, you need to party with me, because if you don't party with me, I'm going to be in a bad mood, and you know what happens when I'm in a bad mood. Or, I sold all your medication, and now I need you to go back to the doctor and lie and get more, or I need you to prostitute so that we can get money to get more drugs. And they'll use this as a way to undermine their sanity and credibility. One of the first women I worked with a long time ago, her husband would tie her to a chair and inject her with heroin. And then he got her dependent on it. So he knew that if she tried to leave him, she would come back looking for more because she would be dope sick. But then he also told her, if you try to leave me, I'm going to tell everybody that you're an addict, and then you're not going to be able to get custody of our son. And so he would also, if she tried to go into recovery, he could find her at methadone clinics or at NA meetings, those types of things. So it really is a way for a batterer to have more control. Now, Scott Hampton, who works with the Batterers Intervention Program, tells how a batterer once told him that the batterer said his job was to make his partner ugly. Not necessarily physically, but by making sure that she's addicted to substances, that making sure that he can make her sound like she's crazy, then people are not going to believe her as much. And so then he can do anything he wants to because he knows other people are going to see her as the problem rather than him being the problem. So if the police show up and she's been coerced into drinking, now the police are told by the abuse, she was out of control. I had to hold her. I had to do what I did because she was coming at me. So then reports of abuse end up being attributed to delusions. Symptoms of trauma are often misdiagnosed as a mental illness. And then there's, victims are afraid to go and get help because they're fearful that somebody will think that just because they have a mental illness or these things that the trauma has caused means they can't be a good parent. So there's all this internalized stigma that they feel like, well, there must be something wrong with me and nobody's going to help me because of that. So it works. People are discriminated against. There's plenty of stigma against people who use substances and who have mental illnesses. And so when somebody says, my job is to make her ugly because then nobody's going to help her, that abuser knows that that stigma is something that he can use against his victim. So here's a power and control wheel. This is part of the handouts for this webinar, so you can get a copy of this. Some of the things that I've already mentioned are on here, so I just invite you to take a look at this. This is your regular power and control wheel that you may have received during your basic domestic violence training, but in here at the end of each one, it adds a piece on substance abuse. So here I'm using emotional abuse. It's also adding here to the humiliation in this is putting her down and making her feel guilty for her past drug use. And physically abusing her for getting high or not getting high. Not being supportive of her recovery, keeping her away from people, preventing her from attending drug treatment and NA or AA meetings, saying she caused the abuse with her drug use, forcing her to prostitute for drugs or drug money, introducing her to drugs, buying the drugs for her, encouraging the use, forcing her to sell drugs, and threatening to hurt her if she uses or doesn't use drugs. So when I talk to medical providers, I often tell them that if they have someone that they feel it has some drug-seeking behavior, to think about who that person could be drug-seeking for. So we also know that substance abuse impacts safety. So when someone is using, it makes it difficult for them to recall events, and they may have some distortion of what actually happened. They could be paranoid and suspicious. There's decreased inhibitions, withdrawal symptoms, increased lethality because of overdose, and increased dependence on their partners due to the health risks or the need for the supply of the drug. So when somebody is trying to get clean and sober, we want to take these things into consideration and talk to them about the dangers. And so it's not about, I think you should stop using drugs and alcohol because it's, a bad thing or it's illegal, but you can say, I'm worried about the impact that this has on your safety, and how can we help you be safe? So sometimes safety planning is around, if you're going to use, how can you use safely? If you're going, if you have something that's going to be coming up that could possibly impact the sobriety that you've gotten, what can we do to help you stay emotionally safe? You know, if someone is prone to using while their kids have are spending the weekend with the ex-partner, and the woman is now alone for the weekend, this could be a time where she is in danger of using. So how can you safety plan emotionally with her for the weekend so that she will either put off using or not use at all? So our job isn't to keep people from using, but it's to help them find other things to do so that maybe they don't use it much, or that they can use safely, or that they will put off using. If you want this case study, you can go ahead and get a hold of me. I will also put it in the handouts for this webinar. So I want to talk about mental health issues. People may get diagnosed with things like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a number of other things that are related to the trauma. So again, remember that if somebody tells you that they've had some diagnoses, that we're really more concerned with what happened to them, not with labeling them with something that they may have been labeled with at some time in their life. So there's some common physical complaints that are related to trauma. All of these things can show up because if you remember from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that they talked about the health effects of those adverse childhood experiences. Those experiences impact our body's ability to be able to fight off infection, affects our immune system. We have the stress hormones in our body that will impact how we feel pain. And so again, when someone has a lot of physical issues, it can be related to their past trauma. So I want to talk a little bit about dissociation, because this is something that you could see or experience when you're talking to someone on the phone or in person. And this is when there's a disruption in how they are consciously. And it usually runs on a continuum, and it could be just sort of shutting down and thinking about something else for a minute. It's that time when you're riding on the road and you wonder where you are because you just sort of zoned out the last couple of miles and you don't remember going, past the exit for Tilton or something. And then for some people, they'll say it's just like my computer shut down and my screensaver went up. Or they can't remember anything that happened in the last half hour. Or someone actually told me once that for them it was like they were sitting and talking to me, but they were actually over in the corner watching themselves talk. So it was sort of an out-of-body experience. And then this can, if in cases of extreme neglect and abuse as a child, some people develop what is known as dissociative identity disorder. Here it's called identity alteration. And in the past, it's also been known as multiple personality disorder. And some of us who've been working in this field for a long time have met people who seem to be a different person than the time we've talked to before. The important thing to do is don't confront the person. Don't say, hey, I think you have a different personality than you did when you had before. What you're going to do is you're going to work with whatever is in front of you, whoever is with you on the phone. Our job is not to question people's reality. Our job is to help them feel safe. And so you're going to work with whoever is in front of you. If somebody is dissociating and they're zoning out, you don't touch them. You just call their name and if you can get their attention, help them ground themselves by telling you what they see in the room, telling them, giving them something with some texture to it. If they're on the phone, saying, how about if you go and get yourself a hot cup of tea or a cold glass of water, because just touching that different temperature in their hand could help ground them. So just, and sometimes when you get them to the fact where they're sort of with you again, you say, what's helped you in the past when this happens, and so that I have some idea on how to help you in the future. Tonic immobility is another form of dissociation, but it's also a stress response. And this is very important because it does happen to a third to half of rape survivors. And a number of people will report severe immobility. And this is when someone suddenly cannot move or call out. It will be happening during the sexual assault, and they feel numb. They can't call out. They feel cold. They may have stiff posture, staring. Their eyes may be closed or open. They are very aware of what's going on, but can't do anything about it. And unfortunately for sexual survivors, these are the survivors that get victim blame because they're saying, well, you must have wanted it because you didn't move. You didn't call out. You didn't fight back. Well, they could move and they could not fight back. And so this is a very important piece to remember, and to be able to tell sexual assault survivors that if this happens, it could have happened for a part of the assault, or it could have happened for all the assault. But it's something that the body does in order to protect itself. The problem is that it also becomes something that the body will do automatically under extreme stress. Once it's done it, it sort of becomes a default mechanism. But I also want you to think about how traumatic this can be. And this in itself is traumatic in addition to the assault, because now I can't trust my body. But also think about the impact this has on male rape survivors, because they believe that if anybody tried to do anything like that to me, I would fight back and nobody would dare. But if they shut down and can't fight back, then they feel like something's wrong with them. So people really need to hear that this is a normal response that the body may do in these times when someone is really fearful of losing their life or being physically restrained. So again, it's really sort of a peritraumatic dissociation. It could create even more post-traumatic stress. It's very traumatic, increases self-blame. Authorities are less likely to believe or be able to successfully prosecute, and may lead to future episodes of tonic immobility. So now I want to talk a little bit about self-injury. You may have people you're talking to on the phone or in person who have cut or burned themselves. And I think it's really important that this is not a suicidal behavior, that a person who truly attempts suicide seeks to end all feelings, whereas a person who self-mutilates is actually trying to feel better. They're trying to feel something. They're just trying to feel differently so that they don't commit suicide. So here it says the assumption is that the alternative to self-injury is acting normally, but on the contrary, the alternative to self-injury is total loss of control and possibly suicide. It becomes a forced choice from among limited options. They feel like this is something that they have to do, or they're going to completely lose control. So we see self-injury as anything that's deliberately done to harm one's body. And it's done without the aid of another person, and it usually causes some tissue damage. Things that are done with a conscious suicidal intent or associated with sexual arousal are not part of self-injury. So for some people, they do it because it calms them down. So people whose trauma response is who are feeling really agitated and anxious and all over the place and can't calm down, they will self-harm in order to settle down and be able to numb out a little bit. People who are dissociating, who are numb and don't feel anything, will self-harm in order to feel something. So people fall into one of those two categories. They believe that there's some neurotransmitters that play a role in this. And there are some people who try self-injury, but it does absolutely nothing for them. So they may do it for a while and then stop. Other people, it becomes like an addictive thing because it's the only thing that seems to help them feel better. It releases some endorphins that help them feel better. And usually people who self-injure grew up in an invalidating environment. That's where there may have been a lot of abuse and neglect, but nobody addressed it with them. Their experiences were not seen as being real, or they were often punished, or the events were trivialized. You know, it wasn't that bad. You know, what Uncle Phil did to you was no big deal. I don't understand what you're talking about. You're just lying. You know, just a number of things. Or just total neglect, just not paying attention to someone's needs at all. So what this invalidation does is it tells the person that they're wrong in their description and analysis of their experiences and what's causing the emotions, beliefs, and actions. And then it tells the person that actually these things happen to you because there's something wrong with you. You caused this. This is all your fault. So, but they're finding that neglect is really the most powerful predictor. And that although childhood trauma contributes heavily to the initiation, lack of severe attachment maintains it. So those who could not remember feeling special or loved by anyone as children were the least able to control their self-destructive behavior. Dissociation, I talked about that. Self-injury assists in reaching the dissociative state or is done while a person's in a dissociative state. I want to go back to this. So some people you talk to may be in what's known as a dialectical behavior therapy treatment program. And this is usually for people who have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, have attempted suicide in the past, and engage in self-harming behavior. And in this program, they learn a number of skills to use so that they don't self-injure. So it's when they go through the first phase of DBT, they learn this. They also have access to a therapist 24 hours a day, so that when they get the urge to self-injure or they're feeling suicidal, they can reach out to this therapist at any time. They're making, but what they can't do is self-injure and then call their therapist. The expectation is that once you learn the skills, you make a choice to use your skills, of which calling the therapist is one of them. You use your skills, but if you make a choice to self-harm and not use your skills, then you're giving up access to your therapist for 24 hours. So the key thing is that someone you're talking to on the phone could say, if you say to them, you know, how about if you could call your therapist in the morning or whatever, and they'll say, no, I'm not allowed to call my therapist for 24 hours after I self-harm. They're telling you the truth. The thing that you can encourage, though, is they more than likely have someone else at the mental health center that they can talk to, like a functional support specialist or someone else. It's just this one therapist that they don't have access to. So encourage them to reach out to someone, and they can also call the crisis center back. But I think it's also for them to maintain contact with their dialectical behavior treatment program. So I'm going to give you some, talk a little bit about some things, other things that you might see or hear. If you have someone who's extremely anxious or agitated, if you're with them personally, just try to decrease the amount of stimulus in the area. try to figure out what's causing them the anxiety and remove it or remove them. If there's a lot of people around, try and get rid of the people or move to a quiet place. You remain calm and validating and just speak in a normal tone of voice. Don't raise your voice. Give them some space. Don't demand answers. Don't start, what happened? Tell me what happened. Just what can I do to help you feel safe? This is the third thing. Remember, we had the number one was it's not what's wrong with the person, it's what happened to them. And the second thing was don't take anything personally. The third thing is, as I talk about these things for the rest of this webinar, is the third thing is how can I help you feel safe right now? So you want to ask the person what's helped in the past, encourage them to use those skills. If they're yelling at you, let them yell. If they're on the phone and they're just yelling and need to, just vent, let them vent. If they start becoming, they become abusive directly towards you, you can end the phone call and say, please call back later, but right now I'm putting up a boundary where I don't want to be listened to these attacks, so you can call back later when you're ready to talk about what's going on. So just those types of things, you have the right to set that boundary, and when you do that, you're teaching them that it's okay to set that boundary, and then maybe someone will have a conversation with them later about that, but you do not have to take personal abuse towards you on the phone. But if they're just yelling and general about everything or even about the program, you can do that. You can listen to them. So if they're feeling depressed and lonely, you can just let them vent, let them talk, accept their feelings. Don't ever say, oh, you should, cheer up, or things aren't that bad, or, those types of things are not helpful at all. But you can say things like, wow, that must be really overwhelming. Or I can understand, I hear, no wonder you're feeling sad. This has been a lot that's happened to you. So they need to have those feelings validated and let them cry. Some advocates want to just get right to the problem solving. Here's the list of things that you can do in order to feel better, or the things that you can do in order to take care of the problem. But don't do those right away. Sometimes, you're going to be on a phone call with somebody and all they're going to do is vent for 20 or 30 minutes and you're going to get off the phone and feel like nothing changed. Well, you listen to that person for 30 minutes and that's what they really needed. And then maybe they will call back in the future and be ready to do the problem solving and the to-do list. But right now they just needed somebody to listen to them. So don't ever feel like you didn't do anything, because just listening to a person is doing a lot. So hallucinations and delusions. When people are having hallucinations, now hallucinations are different from delusions. Hallucinations, people are somewhat aware that they're having hallucinations, and they're going to be willing to do a reality check. So, and you'll see this if you're with somebody in person and they just look at you and they'll say, is that a spider on the table? And really what you do then is, well, look, what can I do to help you feel safe right now? Do you want to leave the room? Do we want to put something over that spot on the table? If they ask, sometimes I see things and I just want to make sure you can, if there's not a spider there, you can tell them if they asked you, okay? Sometimes they just want to do that little reality check. Now, people with delusions, that's a totally different thing. Do not dispute their reality, because they're going to tell you some pretty bizarre things, and you're going to be tempted to say, oh, that's not true. However, if you do that, if you dispute their reality, then you become a part of the conspiracy that created the problem that they're having. So you just go back to that thing I said, how can I help you feel safe? And that may be doing some problem solving. They may, it's like, okay, you said there's a spider in the middle of the table. What can we do to help you feel safe? Let's move to another room. If somebody says, I think I've got a tracking device. I think somebody stole my jacket and put a tracking device in it, and now they're following me and listening to all of my thoughts. You can say, can I help you figure out a place to go and get a new cheap jacket? Just all those types of things. Just staying calm and helping them a little bit with the problem solving. And you may not be able to do that because they may have a whole lot of illogical thoughts that are going on, and you may just have to redirect them somehow. But don't dispute their reality or you become part of the problem. One of the best things that happened is a police officer was called to a home of a woman that he knew, and she was someone who was known to have some mental health issues. And this police officer also knew she was very vulnerable to being victimized, so he wanted her to feel comfortable calling the police. So when he got there, she told him that the neighbors were controlling her sexually with the remote control of the television set. You heard me right. The neighbors were controlling her sexually with the remote control of the television set. Well, the police officer did not dispute that. He did not say, oh, you really need to go check with your doctor because now you're really imagining things. Instead, he helped the problem solve because he wanted her to feel comfortable, and he did not want her to feel like he wasn't safe. So they agreed that if she wrapped her torso in aluminum foil, that could possibly block the radio waves from the remote control. She called him back in a couple of weeks, and she said, thank you, that worked. So now when you do that for someone, they feel safe coming back to you when they really need you. And because if you do anything to make them feel unsafe with you, and that's going to be disputing their reality, if you make them feel unsafe, they're not going to seek services from you or the program anymore. So you want to be able to keep that door open. So just have that understanding that as an advocate, you're not trained to deal with that. Leave that up to other people. Now, they may not, part of what you may want to do at some time is say, maybe you need to go check in with your mental health professional. A lot of people who have delusions are very suspicious of mental health professionals because in the past, if they've expressed some of these disorganized or illogical thinking, they've ended up being hospitalized or put on medication that they did not feel comfortable with. But if you really feel like the person needs to see a mental health person, you can encourage them by saying, you're obviously very upset and stressed by the things that are happening to you. Maybe if you went and talked to somebody, they could help you come up with some ways to be able to manage the way that you're feeling about the situation. Again, you're not denying the person's reality, and you're saying, I understand that this is very upsetting for you, and maybe a mental health professional can help you with how you're feeling about this. It doesn't always work because they're really suspicious of going and seeing mental health people. Okay, and also if you're not licensed, a licensed professional, you don't have duty to warn, and you can't. You cannot call the police or mental health if you feel like this person's a danger to themselves or others. So you're sort of stuck in trying to be able to help this person manage. But there'll be other trainings on that. So you just want to keep things in simple terms. Ask one question at a time. Be concrete and practical. Give the person some time to decode the communication. In other words, let the silences be there because often they're trying to sort out a lot of things that are going on in their brain, and you can help them feel safe by letting them just sort of try and process what's going on before they answer you. And just, again, try and reduce as much noise and outside stimuli and other people as needed so that they can sort of sort out the things that are going on in their head. Oftentimes people are going to have some bizarre behavior, and you just might help them with how they can do some things safely. Be specific. If somebody's putting aluminum foil on their hands or on their head, You could say some people might find that a little bit strange, so let's find you a hat or a pair of gloves in order to be able to cover that out. Okay? But if the behavior is not disruptive or dangerous, it may not need to be addressed because unless there's really a safety issue. This is their way of being in the world, and you just may just talk to them about the things that are possibly not keeping them safe. Okay. So this is pretty much coming to the end of this. There are other things that you can do is being able to understand the social justice perspective of sexual violence and research some of that. It's important that we understand this trauma perspective. We also want to be able to advocate for the rights of people with disabilities and understand the many opportunities for peer support out there. We want to be culturally attuned and understand that trauma can look different from culture to culture. I don't have time to go into all of those ways, but we want to be able to work with people in a culturally appropriate ways. And we want to meet people where they are. We want to have victim-centered, trauma-informed services where we're working with people on meeting the needs that they want to have met and not defining their needs for them. Sometimes we tend to get to a point where we say, I feel like I'm working harder than they are. Well, it could be that the goals that they're working on are actually our goals rather than their goals. And if we sit back with them and say, what is it that you really want? They may come up with some goals that they'll feel a little, feel like they can actually work on. And keep those goals also in small increments, doable, so that they can feel like they have frequent successes rather than having too many things to do at one time. Break it down into easily doable steps. And some of those things they may need some help with. Some trauma survivors are going to have difficulty going to housing office and filling out paperwork, and they may need to have someone with them a couple of times until they feel comfortable doing it themselves. Coaching them through phone calls, all of these things, because empowerment is not something we just take off a shelf and give to somebody. It's something that we help them find within themselves, and we do that by being supportive, and we also recognize that they don't necessarily have skills right off the bat, and they need to have some skills taught to them. And when we do that in an empowering way, where we feel like they're going to be able to take control over their life, then it's going to be a more positive situation for them. So here are some resources. The PowerPoint for this is in your handouts, and you can look at the ACEs Too High and ACEs Connection website, and there's also a lot of information on the National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health website. And there's a great book out there called Domestic Violence Advocacy by Jill Davies and Eleanor Lyon. Thank you.